Welcome to the Conservative Alliance podcast, the show that discusses everything from a libertarian conservative twist. I'm James, and today we're talking about the Christian People's Alliance with Sid. On today's show, we have another instalment of Meet the Party. I'm joined today by Sidney Cordle MBE and leader of the Christian People's Alliance. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you.
How are you doing under the lockdown with the current conditions?
It's okay. I mean, I tend to do a lot of work from home anyway. I do normally go into London a lot on the train, which of course I'm not doing at the moment. But
No, definitely not.
and I've been doing a lot of reading, some of it very, very interesting. So I've been catching up on that, which is very useful.
It is. It's the only upside I found to it. I'm catching up with a lot of stuff that I've been meaning to get done. So I say this on every episode, should you be listening for the first time. I intend for all the questions to remain the same for each party, with a few variations to suit their preferences. So I'll start with an easy one, if that's all right, Sid. What is the history of your party?
Okay, well, the party was formed around the year 2000. Initially campaigning in the London mayor elections and standing for the London Assembly.
Yeah.
And when we launched, we got just over 3.5% of the vote in that election, which was over 50,000 votes in London. But when we launched, obviously, we were something completely new on the block, and we got a little bit of attraction. At that time, we had an excellent leader in Ram Gidamal, who was highly respected, and even the Evening Standard said, this man will make an excellent mayor. Maybe he's the best candidate. So obviously that was good. From then, we started campaigning a lot in Newham, where we had some people standing in local elections, and the party became very focused on Newham and London.
Perfect. So, talking, of course, about the elections, what electoral results have you had so far, roughly speaking? What sort of success has your party seen? Now, when I say success, of course, I don't mean election wins, but, just the amount of votes you've got. Generally, what's your performance been like?
Well, we did win some seats in Newham. We had some councillors there.
Perfect.
But in a sense, it was a problem for me anyway, because the whole party was so focused just on one council ward or 2 or 3 council wards in the end we tried to expand to throughout the whole country. We weren't getting national publicity, and we were having very few people standing in general elections, and they tended to be focused in London. Now, when I first joined the party in early 2004, so it hadn't been going that long when I joined, I was in Sheffield, and I realised that in Sheffield I was completely detached from the main work that was going on of the party. In the last general election, we got 6,500 votes. The previous one, we got 5,500, which in general election was not bad. In 2017, we were actually the 8th party in England, believe it or not.
It's a good result to have.
Well, there's actually a massive gap between the Green Party, who are the smallest of the big parties, and I think the Yorkshire Party was the party that got the next most votes after the Green Party, which was getting a fraction of what they were getting. So actually crossing the divide between being a small party and being a medium-sized party, if you like, is incredibly difficult.
I can imagine under the current electoral structure anyway. So for people who, of course, who have never heard of the Christian People's Alliance before, what does your party stand for? Can you tell me what are your fundamental values of both you and the party?
Okay, well, obviously the most important thing to us is standing for Christian values, which are historically have been the backbone of our society.
Definitely.
But they are no longer considered the backbone of our society. In fact, the media and the Labour Party, the Lib Dems in particular, and the Greens are consciously opposing Christian values, and the Conservative Party are largely going along with the agenda, mostly because they actually changed their position in 2003, because I was part of the Conservative Party in 2003, and Ian Duncan Smith actually had a 3-line whip to compel Conservative MPs to vote against same-sex couples being allowed to adopt children. Now, looking at it today, the idea the Conservative Party would vote en masse to make it not illegal for homosexual couples to adopt children would seem very far-fetched. But that's what was happening then.
Yeah.
And Michael Howard came along and said, people choose to lead their lives differently these days, and we've got to adapt our policies accordingly. And I knew what that meant. That meant out with Christian values, in with New Age liberal values, which is exactly what he did. David Cameron was Michael Howard's chosen successor. And David Cameron introducing same-sex marriage was very much what was started by Michael Howard in 2003 when they ousted Ian Duncan Smith and he came in. But see, the Conservative Party is not a party of principle, it's a party of power. So
party of vote winning.
Exactly. So they said, we've got to do this in order to get back into power. So we've got to do whatever we need to get back into power, we have to do.
Yeah.
So I don't actually believe that they were right, because I believe if Ian Duncan Smith had stood in 2005 in that general election, I believe he could well have won it. As it was, between Tony Blair and Michael Howard was considered to be a man of the night, as he was called, and not a very pleasant individual. And it was like between the devil and the deep blue sea. At that point, I think people wanted Tony Blair out, but they didn't want Michael Howard in.
So almost like the 2017 situation with Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn. They didn't particularly like Theresa May, but Jeremy Corbyn was even worse.
Yes, well, I think there were other things going on in that election, but
definitely, which we can move on to now if you want. So,
yes,
where does your party stand on Brexit?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential that we leave, come what may, whether we have an agreement with the European Union or we don't have an agreement with the European Union, we leave.
Yeah.
The idea that this is falling off a cliff and will be a complete disaster is just totally wrong. I'm quite certain that we can leave and trade under WTO rules or whatever we trade under and make a success of it. It's interesting, Mervyn King, the previous governor of the Bank of England, said that what we actually gained by being in the European Union was roughly 5.7 billion a year in saved tariffs. But what it costs us is over 10 billion a year. Yeah. So if we just simply leave and trade under WTO rules and pay the tariffs that other non-EU countries are paying, then we'll actually gain some 4 billion a year. Now, this isn't something that the media are telling you.
It's because the media don't want it. The media are part of that, you could say, established elites, where we have to go along with what they believe in, and if you affect their worldview, you are a naysayer.
Yes,
ultimately.
But see, it's interesting. You see, one of our core values is standing for the truth. Understandably, I suppose, as Christians.
Yeah.
But it annoys me intensely the extent to which we have total misinformation coming out. Now, a clear example of that, for instance, was during the EU referendum. They made an awful lot about this figure on the bus that we could spend 350 more million per week on the NHS if we leave the European Union.
Yep.
And they said that was a false figure. Well, it was a misleading figure because it was a gross figure and the net figure is about 200 million. And it'd be much bigger, much better if they put the net figure on the bus of 200 million. But so it was misleading. But George Osborne said, if we vote to leave, then there will be an emergency budget. He will increase income tax by 2p in the pound. Another 15 billion will have to be cut from public services. 820,000 jobs will be lost. There will be a run on the pound. The pound will go down by 15%. We will dive into recession. There will inevitably be a recession immediately after we vote to leave. And this was just a sample of what was said.
Yeah.
Yet the media never said, oh, he lied to us.
No.
But it's obviously he was lying to us. And so we've got one misleading figure against, on the other hand, blatant lies being told.
Yeah. You could say it was a terrible campaign. I'm just glad, though, that we did vote to leave as a country for the better, really, going forward in the future.
Well, what's amazing, really, is that on the one hand, you've got enormous amounts of money coming in from the European Union. If you remember, David Cameron actually put a very nice booklet through every door in the country before the referendum campaign even
10
started.
million quid, wasn't it, roughly?
Yeah. So that was done before the campaign started, just to prep people up as to the advantages of being in the European Union. And then during the campaign itself, the Remain side had enormous amounts of money. But the amazing thing was that the Leave side also had enormous amounts of money, because some very rich people were willing to pump money into campaigning to leave.
Yeah.
So and undoubtedly, having Boris Johnson as a figurehead also made an enormous difference.
Well,
but yeah,
Cameron was gutted, you could say, when Boris Johnson went against him and went on the Leave side, because he knew deep down that Boris Johnson is political gold mine, at least, when trying to get over the normal voter, you could say.
Oh, well, I said before the election that if it's UKIP versus Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem, we'll lose, because we've got to have the campaign led by Conservative politicians. It has to be. It cannot be led by Nigel Farage.
No, they're not palatable enough for the country, or the moderates, you could say.
Well, when it was a referendum and you wanted a 50% vote, then UKIP could possibly, have got as much as 30% of the vote in some circumstances, but they weren't going to get 50% of the vote.
No.
And so the referendum would have been lost. But yeah, we'd had to have Conservative politicians. I don't think it necessarily had to be Boris Johnson. I think there's other very good politicians there in the background. Daniel Hannan, I like him. I rate him very highly. I think he's a great guy.
He is.
Yeah.
He's one of the good few bunches within the Conservative Party not willing to sell his principles for an election.
Well, exactly, yes. So, but yeah, I think there's other people that could have led it, but it had to be led by the Conservatives, and Boris Johnson was the ideal figure. But anyway, we voted to leave, and now we've got to leave completely. And there's still a battle. We actually said before the referendum that if we vote to leave, that's when the battle will start. And we were, of course, absolutely right, because we knew it wasn't going to be straightforward.
No.
All the history of the European Union is if people vote the wrong way in a referendum, then you have to vote again. And that's what I said before the referendum. If we vote to leave, then they want us to vote again.
Well, a book written by Christopher Booker called The Castle of Lies, he writes in there that we've got something known as the enemy within. The European Union is not our enemy. Ultimately, I say enemy in the terms of, us wanting to leave, but that was only the start of the problem, was voting to leave. Then we were battling the civil service and the establishment. No, that's what he was referring to when he says the enemy within. Those establishments were the ones who were really going to be the problem for us, and it turned out to be a correct assessment once we did vote to leave. It's
very interesting, you see. When I was a councillor in Sheffield in the past, obviously I was a Conservative councillor, although 18 of us on a council of some 65 people.
Yeah.
Most of the rest, I think, were about 9 Lib Dems, and then the rest were Labour. But because Labour were in charge of the council and had been in charge of the council for a very long time, there were lots of political appointments going in among the officers. In fact, it was normal when it came to an officer appointment, they were looking for a member of the Labour Party. Now, unfortunately, it seems that there's an awful lot of this happened in the civil service as well. That they've really worked hard to get their people into the civil service who basically support their policies. How they've managed to do it, well, I honestly think they've had a drive to do it, where probably the Conservative Party have been more sort of approached it from the point of view that, the civil service are neutral, we mustn't be involved in civil service appointments, they have to be completely separate from politics. That's largely been the Conservative view, but it's not been the Labour view. The Labour view is we've got to get our people in.
So, moving on, during the budget, which does seem quite a long way away, the government announced a raft of proposed project spending. So with that in mind, what capital projects would you like to see us take on?
Well, uniquely among political parties at the moment, our position is that we desperately need a new London airport built in the Thames Estuary.
Okay.
Now, at the moment, Heathrow is wanting to expand, Gatwick's wanting to expand, Stansted's wanting to expand, Luton's wanting to expand, and there's all campaigns to stop them expanding. But the truth is that there is a lack of capacity in the London airports, but we don't want lots of little airports around London. What we need is one big airport,
Yeah.
which was Heathrow. But a lot of people don't appreciate. Sidney Cordle didn't appreciate, in fact, that what a hub airport is. A hub airport is people flying in and flying out. Now, a lot of people that fly into Heathrow don't come to London. I mean,
No.
people, for instance, that might be going from New York to Copenhagen will get a flight to London and then a flight on from London to Copenhagen.
Yeah.
So you can't, people aren't going to fly into Heathrow and then get a train to Gatwick and fly out from Gatwick to Copenhagen, and they're not going to do it. They'd rather fly into Paris and, or even Madrid. It's just, they'd rather do that than having to change airports. So at the moment, Heathrow is right at the maximum of its capacity. I mean, if you've flown into Heathrow, you know that you go circling round and round for about an hour before you actually find a landing slot, because you're in a queue of about 6 planes that are all flying round and round Heathrow waiting to land. And that's what it's like.
I've never flown into Heathrow, not gonna lie, so I wouldn't know. Unfortunately, no, I've remained quite up in the north, to be honest with you. When going to Europe,
Okay.
I'd rather use the train.
Okay, well, I can assure you that's what happens. So there's a lack of capacity. Now, if we're to have a third runway in Heathrow, then it involves bridging the M25, it involves demolishing a whole load of villages, and it's probably only going to solve the problem for about 50 years.
Yeah.
So that in 50 years, they'll be then looking at a fourth runway because of the way things are expanding. So we can actually build a 4 runway or possibly potentially 6 runway airport in the Thames Estuary. Now, one of the advantages of that as well is that if you have an airport in the Thames Estuary, you can fly at 24 hours.
Yeah.
Heathrow can only operate 17 hours. All the London airports at the moment can only operate 17 hours because of the noise of night flying. So you'd have an airport that could operate 24 hours. So even having 4 runways means that you'd immediately have another 7 hours flying per runway as well. And it could be built easily, or relatively easily, because there's one being built at Hong Kong on a very similar sort of basis. So we know it can be built. That's not a problem. The expense is going to be the transport links to the new airport. But you see, if we were willing to put something like to build the airport would cost maybe 25 billion. The transport links will probably be another 75 billion. So we're looking at having to put something like 100 billion into it, which is a lot of money.
It is.
But the benefits are going to be enormous because it's going to make London the hub airport, for Europe, which it has been in the past. Heathrow has been in the past, but it's actually beginning to lose that status because of its lack of capacity. So we desperately need a brand new airport that's going to be the main airport for Europe, for people flying in, particularly from America or whatever. And the amount of wealth that can be created by it will be phenomenal, far, far more than HS2. I mean, HS2 is now being built, it's going ahead, so on and so forth. But our position previously was to have a new airport in the Thames Estuary is a lot more important than building HS2. HS2 can be built afterwards, but not before. That was our position. But obviously now they're going ahead.
Well, I was just about to bring HS2 up, so I'm glad you have. It does seem, as someone from the north, as a nominal waste of money for such a short amount of time saved. And then HS2 is only London to Birmingham, and then they call it HS2B, which is Birmingham to Leeds, which is going to be, 20, 30 years' time? By that point, technology is outdated. Well, I
think they're planning to build a link to Manchester and Liverpool a bit earlier, but yeah, the amount of wealth that HS2 is going to create is not going to be that much. No. Because there will be some benefits undoubtedly in being able to get to Birmingham in half an hour. I think they're talking about, or maybe a little bit more than that. But there will be some benefits, but it's not going to be anything like the international benefits that we're going to have from from having a new airport in the Thames estuary. Nothing by comparison.
No.
So I mean, we're talking about billions. I mean, it would also help the whole east of London. I mean, we've already got Canary Wharf there on the east of London, but the wealth in the past has obviously been a lot more on the west.
Yeah.
But if we have a brand new airport in the east, there's so much land, there's so much space there to be building stuff as well. You know, there's going to be an enormous amount of stuff that will be built, factories, goodness knows what, built around the new airport. You know, so it's the potential as a wealth creator is phenomenal. Now, one thing which people need to understand is that in 2010 we had 175 billion per year deficit, which was left to us by the Labour Party when they left office.
Yeah.
Now, we immediately set about what the Labour Party call austerity. But what they actually did was to maintain, or if not increase, capital spending, but cut revenue spending. And that's how they managed to get the deficit down. The Labour Party didn't understand what they were doing, and they still don't now understand how they got the deficit down. At the time, if you remember, Ed Miliband and the Labour Party were saying, "Oh, Plan A won't work. Plan B, you know, you've got to abandon this austerity. Austerity won't work because you're going to be cutting spending, and cutting spending means reducing the size of the economy. And if you reduce the size of the economy, then it's just going to make more poverty, less tax increase, and you'll end up with the deficit increasing." That's what they were saying.
Yeah.
Which was sort of like Keynesian economics, if you like. But the reality is, because they maintained capital spending, but reduced revenue spending, that's why they managed to get the deficit down. Now, they did that consistently for 10 years. Well, not for quite for 10 years, sorry, for about 8 years. And doing that consistently for 8 years meant it came down right down from 175 to 25 billion. But now, in the position we are now, as we leave the European Union, what we've got to do is to increase capital spending as we leave the European Union.
Yeah.
Maintain revenue spending now where it is. We don't need to cut it anymore, but we need to control it. We can't just let it get out of hand. And in that way, the economy will expand, will create the wealth we need, will take our place in the world as a stronger, more efficient, effective nation.
Not trying to be a doom and gloom kind of guy, but with what's going on currently, the lockdown of the economy almost entirely at standstill, is that the right outlook now, do you think? I'd love it to be the outlook, but this economic damage that has been created by this lockdown, will it have an inevitable impact on that?
Well, obviously, we're going to have to assess that as and when it's over. What the government doing at the moment is correct to just expand borrowing on a short-term basis in order to get over this crisis to maintain the economy. But yeah, once it's over and done, we'll need to make some sort of assessment. But what we mustn't do is to stop capital spending because of the coronavirus. If we do that, that would be a complete disaster for the economy.
No.
So whatever we do, we've got to maintain the capital spending and possibly increase capital spending as we get back to normal after the coronavirus.
Okay. So the Christian People's Alliance is standing for policy no other party offers. Policies for justice, transformation and prosperity across the nation. So I do have to ask, in light of this, are you in favour of privatisation?
Okay, yeah, well, it's an interesting point because a lot of people don't seem to understand, the benefits of privatisation. Now, absolutely, we are in favour of privatisation, to answer the question. But it annoys me intensely that Jeremy Corbyn, with his, we're going to nationalise the railways, we're going to nationalise gas and electricity, we're going to nationalise
broadband.
We're going to nationalise broadband, we're going to nationalise all this stuff. And young people, inverted commas, are like, these are great policies. And the media is doing nothing at all to say, well, look, we'll show you what British Rail was actually like before it was privatised. People need to know what it was like. And you need to know all the figures on the water companies. The water companies had nil investment going in, because the problem was that when it came to tough government decisions with a limited amount of money, what do you spend your money on? Do you spend your money on the NHS, on education, or do you spend your money on improving the water pipes? Well, I'm afraid the NHS and education won every time because it was a lot more visible. It was a lot more immediate benefit.
Yeah.
People, water pipes, okay, we're having a lot of burst pipes, having a lot of leaks, but so what? Somebody comes and mends the leak, and then we just get on with it. We just patch up the pipes, but it was getting to a point where the leaks were getting out of hand. But it was like, well, but nothing. But after privatisation, all of a sudden, there's enormous investment going into new water pipes, into new reservoirs, and we now have a very efficient water system. But obviously, if Corbyn came into power and and nationalised the water system, it wouldn't be disastrous overnight. You'd still have the benefits of all the investment that's gone in the past. But bit by bit, the service would deteriorate. The same would happen to the railways. Now, one other thing people need to understand and appreciate, I mean, as I say, I was a councillor back in the 80s in Sheffield.
Yeah.
And I was a councillor at a time when the roads were repaired by Sheffield Works Department. All the bins were emptied by Sheffield Refuse Collection Department. All the repairs on council houses were done also by the Sheffield Works Department. And everything was absolutely awful. I mean, the roads were massive potholes in them. The bin collection service was terrible and incredibly expensive. I remember sitting in committee and the officers say, well, if instead of having 7 people on each bin lorry, we could manage to reduce it to 6, that would be a significant saving. Well, the bin lorries now go around with about 3 or 4 people.
I was just about to say it's even less now.
Yeah, and at that time, the bin man used to go and pick up the bins from the back, so you had one bin man who would be running around, going and picking up the bin from the back of the house and going and putting it on the front of the house, for then somebody to come and for the bin lorry that was coming behind to empty it. And of course they were all steel bins, they weren't wheelie bins, so it was all very heavy, picking them all up, an exhausting task.
I can imagine.
For the bin man, it was generally reckoned that the bins were too heavy for the customer to lift, so only super fit bin men were able to go and lift the bins, and that was the system that operated. Under privatisation, we've developed a system that works, that's efficient, that people put their wheelie bin out now. You have wheels on your bin, so it's easy to move, and the bin men that empty it don't have to pick it up and empty it out into the lorry, which they used to. They just attach it to something, which then just puts it up and empties it for the bin man. So their job is so much easier. So the whole system is way more efficient. Now, the Labour Party have this problem with profit.
Yeah.
They're making profits out of emptying bins. It's terrible. We've got to nationalise it and stop this profit making. Well, when it was done by the council refuse collection department, it cost way more. And so it was all going a lot more on the council taxpayers in Sheffield to pay for this terribly inefficient system. So you bring in a new system, it costs a lot less, and the people doing it make a profit. Now, what's wrong with them making a profit?
Nothing. Ultimately, though, profits do increase efficiency, especially when there is a budget at the end of it. So it is a system that works.
Well, that's right. Well, what increased the efficiency is competition, because somebody comes along and says, well, I've got a system that can work, I can do it cheaper, and I can make a profit. And somebody else comes along with a more expensive system, and their more expensive system is thrown out and the cheaper system is brought in. But it's competition. And it's competition that's effective and works. If people make a profit from producing a cheaper, more efficient system, what on earth is wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. No. And it applies to absolutely every industry. And this idea that the socialists have of hating profit is just so stupid. Stupid.
So your party states that you understand the need of business. but
Yes.
you also understand the most basic needs of our poorest neighbours. So I
Yes.
have to ask, what would you do for the elderly and the infirm?
Okay. Well, okay. If I can answer that in two ways. First of all, that
Yeah, it's fine.
we have a policy of introducing a turnover tax, which basically that will be offset against corporation tax, and the idea of that is to get money off Google and Facebook and Starbucks and Amazon and all these people that send their profits abroad, so they don't pay corporation tax. They would pay the turnover tax, and it would basically give British business a competitive advantage. And we reckon from that we can raise something like 30 billion.
Okay.
It would operate, by the way, a little bit like a company VAT. So in national insurance, you have employees' national insurance and you have
Yeah.
employers' national insurance. With VAT, we have the purchaser pays, but the seller pays nothing. But interestingly enough, a lot of other countries have the seller pays tax. But in our economy at the moment, the seller pays no tax. No, so that's how it would operate. It would operate as a seller's tax, so that as every time the seller sells something, they pay a tax.
Okay.
So let's say if you offset it against corporation tax, it helps British business. So that's how we'd raise the money. So having raised that money, we reckon we could raise at least 30 billion from that. 12 billion we would use to restore the cuts to benefits. So George Osborne cut £12 billion when universal credit was introduced. And Ian Duncan Smith, who was in charge of it, said there's nothing wrong with this new system. The only thing that's wrong with it is that George Osborne cut 12 billion out of it. And you couldn't introduce the new system with 12 billion less than the old system. And
No.
this thing that the Labour Party have got of, we're going to get rid of universal credit. Oh, really? So what are you going to introduce in its place? Well, we haven't thought about that yet. It's just nonsense. But
Inherently, it's not a bad system, though, universal credit, because it used to be that you'd have to apply to your council for your housing benefit, your council tax benefit, and if you weren't a penny more than you told them, you'd have to get it reassessed.
Yes.
With it all being dealt with now by one body, HMR, well, not HMRC, sorry, Department of Work and Pensions, they give you a leeway. So even if you earn a little bit more now than what you originally told them, they've got a threshold. As long as you don't breach that threshold, they will not reassess you. But councils were punitive to the point where if you weren't a penny more, you'd have to tell them and get reassessed.
Yes.
So it's a good system. It's efficient.
It's a much better system. The problem is the 5-week waiting period. But this 5-week waiting period, they only brought in because of the 12 billion cuts. So we'd restore those cuts and get rid of that 5-week waiting period. Now, for elderly people, what we want to do there is to provide elderly people with a personal assistant. Now, this is to help people who are in between, entirely able to look after themselves and care for themselves, and on the other hand, now need to go into a home and need round-the-clock care.
Okay.
So people that are entirely able to look after themselves obviously are fine. Many people right up to into their 80s are able to live on their own if they need to and look after themselves without a problem. But the time comes when they need help. Now, at the point when they need help, what happens then is they start being assessed by the council. There's a lot of forms that have to be filled in. Sometimes as carers will come and give them some help and support. Sometimes they get some meals provided for them and so on and so forth. But so people now are staying in their own home, but they're getting some sort of support. The process of filling in all these forms and making these applications, and sometimes what happens also is that the house needs to be altered, so they can't do stairs anymore, so they now house has to be altered so they live downstairs. The whole process of applying for all these changes is extremely difficult and consuming. Now, obviously, if you've got family nearby, that's great. Family can come in and help.
Of course.
There can also be a problem with that because sometimes people, carers and even family as well, can start taking advantage of elderly people because they can't handle their money anymore. They start actually stealing off them. This is quite commonplace.
Yeah.
So what we want is to introduce a personal assistant. So at the point where the elderly person is no longer able just to look after themselves, they need help, the first thing that they would do will be to contact a personal assistant who will come and visit and help them with all the forms and the applications which they need to do, and do a proper financial assessment at the same time, so they find out exactly what funds they've got, and what they're entitled to, and document the funds that they've got. So as they go into a position where they start to need care and they start to need help, what this costs is going to be properly documented, and they're going to be assisted with it. So they're not just suddenly going to lose complete control of their finances because somebody else takes over. They're given support to help to control their finances through the process, and that personal assistant will continue to work with them right through to the point where they need to go into a home. That's the plan. And we believe that will give significant support to the elderly and close a gap that at the moment exists.
Well, definitely no other parties thought of it, so I'm glad someone at least has. And
this is typical, I hope, of the Christian People's Alliance. I mean, we've got policies. What we seek to do right across the board is to have policies that nobody else has thought of, but which are significant and important for society. One of the results of that, by the way, is that it frequently happens that our policies are then implemented by government, which in an election nobody else is putting forward. I mean, for instance, we were saying that we need to increase the national insurance threshold substantially to bring it in line with the tax threshold, because national insurance is being paid from £5,000.
Yeah.
In the last budget, the Chancellor did that, but it wasn't in the Conservative manifesto. It was in our manifesto.
Well, at least someone's listening, but it's just a shame it weren't yourselves implementing it. So,
we don't mind, because we're quite capable of always finding other policies which they haven't thought of.
It's a good position to take. I'm going to move on to a different set now, so defence and crime. Yes. So it's true to suggest, I think, that most Conservatives, including myself, do support Trident, but you don't as a party. Why is that?
Yes. Well, it's both moral and practical. Now, the first thing that people have to understand is, as a Christian, I could not press a button that would kill millions of people. I couldn't do it. I mean, you say, well, well, if you couldn't do it, if you couldn't press the button, then it's not deterrent. So you say, well, in that case, you're not going to defend us, so we couldn't vote for you. But actually, when you look at it practically, it's better to be able to shoot down an incoming missile and to defend from missiles than it is to tell a country, if you send a missile to us, then if Moscow sends a missile and destroys London, then we'll send a missile and destroy Moscow. But that worked to a degree when Russia was our only real enemy, but now we've got Pakistan who've got nuclear weapons. I mean, Pakistan, we're going to literally say to them, if you send a missile and destroy London, when we'll send a missile and destroy your capital, Islamabad, I believe.
I'm not too sure, I'm not going to lie.
Is that going to stop them? I mean, it's increasingly, you come to a point, and what about Iran? If Iran, we might very soon have nuclear weapons. It's a lot better in the long term to develop systems where you can shoot down incoming missiles or lock onto them and divert them into the ocean. Now, this sort of technology is there, it's been developed, and a lot of countries are focusing on it.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting when America was threatened by North Korea, and possibly we're going to send a missile over to America. The first thing they did was to put some missile defense in place, so that if North Korea launched a missile, they would immediately try and shoot it down, which is a sensible thing to do. Not to say, oh, well, if you shoot one to us, we're going to send one on Pyongyang, whatever it is. Because it's like, well, that dictator's not going to bother. Who cares if you destroy Pyongyang? I don't care. Well, it did in the end. He backed off, thank goodness, and the problem was over. But what you don't want is to be taking a weak position. Oh, we'll have to give in to them, because if we don't give in to them, they're going to send a nuclear weapon our way. You want to be in a position where you can say, well, no way we're giving in to them. If they send a nuclear weapon our way, we'll stop it mid-flight. There's no way we're going to let it through. Now, if that was Russia. Russia have the capacity to launch maybe 200 missiles, which shooting down 200 missiles would be quite difficult. Shooting down a few missiles that might come from a country like Pakistan or Iran would be relatively simple and straightforward. But to have proper defence, that's the technology we need to focus on. And our policy is missile shield, developing technology to lock onto missiles, to divert them. That's what we need to focus on to have effective defence for this nation. And you can apply this to long range missiles. It's not only applied to short range missiles. Israel has all these systems in place, but they don't just have the Patriot missiles are the ones that shoot down the short range missiles, but they also have a Ben Gurion system that shoots down long range missiles. You can do it. All the technology is there, but we don't have it. Britain doesn't have it.
Knife crime has been getting out of hand for a while. It's fair to say, especially in London. What policies would you as a party put in place to solve it and reduce crime generally?
Okay, well, our policy on crime, our first policy on crime is we want to work with offenders. Now, what happens at the moment is that if someone is put into prison, if they're living on their own, then obviously they can't pay the rent or the mortgage, whatever it is, and the house is repossessed.
Yeah.
So when they come out of prison, the house isn't there. All their possessions have gone. They've got nothing. If they're living in a family, then they come out of prison, and sometimes the probation will say, you can't go back to your family, you're a danger to them, you're not allowed to live with them. So for either reason, very frequently prisoners come out of prison and they're just on the streets or in hostels or something. Now, the result of that is that the reoffending rate is very high. Across the board, it's above 30%. In some places, it's above 60% reoffending. But it's almost understandable. Now, the reason why we know this is because of food banks, because, we're running food banks. You always sit with a food bank and say, why are you here? And it's amazing the number of times that people say, I've recently come out of prison and I've got no benefits. I can't get benefits. I've got nowhere to live at the moment. I haven't got any food. It's just like, oh. And so you start talking to the people and you start working with them, and you realize this is a massive problem across the country. Now, there are organisations like Saltbox in Stoke and the Message Trust in Manchester, Christian charities, that are working with offenders, and they've got in their areas, they've got reoffending rates down to 10%. So you think, well, if a charity can do it, how much more should the government be doing this? Now, by doing this, you win every way. You win because there's fewer crimes.
Yeah.
You win because there's fewer people in court. You win because there's less pressure on prisons, and you also win because the person who is in prison has got something to look forward to when they come out. Because when they come out, we're going to provide you somewhere to live immediately before you come out. We're going to look after you, basically. And if you've got a drink or drug problem, we're going to work with you to help you overcome that problem. We're not just going to leave you with a drink problem on the streets, just getting drunk, or with a drug problem. We're just going to leave you on the streets on drugs all the time. We're going to work with you to help you overcome the problem when you come out of prison. So obviously, you don't solve every case, but it's the fact that if you get reoffending rates down to 10% from 30% and across the board, there's going to be way fewer crimes. Now, that's not the only thing to do. Obviously, you also need to have youth centres working, and you need to give people positive outlets for their energies. So, which is sometimes with knife crime, the problem is being caused by very young people. But again, what you don't want is for those young people that commit some sort of knife crime to then to start on a process, which means that they're now going to be criminals for life.
Yeah.
You've got to work with them to get them off the crime. But you've also got to work with them with youth centres and whatever to stop them committing crimes in the first place, if at all possible. So those are the two avenues that we will pursue very strongly, and we believe that they would work effectively. the Boris Johnson answer of just building more prisons doesn't actually solve crime in the long term. In the short term, obviously, it takes some people off the streets, but in the long term, because the reoffending rate is so high, it doesn't actually mean that you have less crime.
Do you not believe, though, that the rise in crime could be due to the lack of Christianity in today's society? Now, that's not so much the church's fault, but just the constant barrage it's under from other cultures, the government, the left elite, basically.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and obviously, one of our core policies is to give people a grant of £12,000 when they get married, provided they go for at least 3 sessions or 5 sessions. We could do it either way of marital awareness training. Now, this is to make people think a lot more before they get married, think about what's involved in it, and also another 6,000 before you have your first child, again with training in what's involved in child rearing. Now, with these things, we want to make it foolish for people not to get married, have children within wedlock, and take advantage of the grants that are available. Now, obviously, more family stability. I mean, at the moment, we've got a marriage tax allowance of £1,000, so you get an advantage of £200 a year, and the Labour Party can't even cope with that.
No,
I say, the first thing they'll do is to get rid of the marriage person's tax allowance. It's like it's worth £200 a year, but that's too much. I mean, we would have it so the tax allowance was fully transferable. So if one member of the family is working and the other is at home looking after the children, and then the one working will get double the tax allowance of somebody who's on their own. But so it will be fully transferable, and we'd also change the capital gains tax rules. So at the moment, if capital gains tax goes on individuals, but when you get married, you actually lose the capital gains tax benefit. So it can be better in some circumstances to cohabit than to get married. So we would immediately give married couples double the capital gains tax as well, to remove the possibility that you could be better off cohabiting than marrying. But all these things are to create more family stability, more stability in society, and the result will certainly be there'll be a reduction in crime, and there'll be a reduction in use of the National Health Service, and all these things. Absolutely, that will happen over time. But if we say that's our only policy, then people will say, oh well, you're too simplistic. So we have to say absolutely that's one of our policies, but it's not our only policy.
Well, it's good to hear that there is at least a party out there finally again. It should have been the Conservative Party's position at one point, but not anymore, but at least believes in the family stability. So we're going to move on, I think. It's been good, of course, to hear what policies you've got in place. Where do you see the Christian People's Alliance in 10 years' time? I know you've been going since 1999, so we're on, 21 years?
Well, I became leader at 2012, so I've been going it's the end of 2012, so I've only been going for about just over 7 years. And the early part of the party, as I say, was very much focused on London and focused on campaigning in very small areas. My objective is to have candidates standing in just about every seat. I mean, I said 500 candidates standing in general elections. So really, I mean, this is what UKIP managed to do initially and projected itself. I mean, and the Greens, they managed to get to a point of 400, 500 candidates standing. Once you've got candidates on the ballot paper, then you become an option for government. So, I mean, in the last 2 general elections, we've had about 30 candidates, which is like 5% of the total, which is okay. But with 30 candidates, you're not an option for government. So I'm really pushing in that direction, and all the time with what I'm doing, I've actually found something like 300 possible candidates, but at the moment we're not funded. So if we were funded, and I mean, we've been trying to run elections with budgets of about 10 or 15,000, which when you think the Conservative Party putting 18 to 20 million, we've got rather a big gap.
Definitely.
It's very difficult with 10 or 15,000 to fight an election where you're putting up 500 candidates. I mean, it means that every candidate's got to pay for themselves and got to pay for their own leaflets, which is difficult to find people that literally say, yeah, I don't mind putting £1,000 into this election. And also, we also have the disadvantage, if you like, where we encourage everyone to think long term. This is not just about one election. You've got to think long term. We've got to build the party long term. That's something I was saying from 2012.
Yeah.
But then we've had some candidates that have stood and have said, well, that election cost me over £1,000. I'm not willing to pay another £1,000 to stand again. So it's like, they would make perfectly good candidates if only we had the resources to say, right, we're going to back you or support you.
Yeah.
And in those segments, say, okay, by all means, if you're supporting me, I'll stand again. So we need the money, we need the resources, but our target in 10 years' time is to have at least 500 candidates standing in general elections, to have a lot of people standing in local elections, to have party political broadcasts, to be a real option for government. That's our target.
It's a good target to have. It's definitely needed at the moment. One thing that will fit into this question, so I don't need to ask it separately, is how are you approaching voters of opposing opinions? More importantly, how are you trying to convince people who are secularists, who don't believe in religion anymore? Because they're the ones we need to get over. They're the ones that will vote for you, but unfortunately don't at the moment, because as soon as they see the word Christian, they're like, no thank you, just because of whatever lies they've been told throughout their lives.
Okay, well, our policy towards people like that is open debate. So our policy towards liberals or Muslims is to say, we want to have freedom. We believe in freedom of speech. We want to have open debate. We want to debate in universities, debate on television. Let's talk about these issues. Let's see who's telling the truth, if you like.
Yeah.
Who's got the best approach. Our policies towards elections is to get our message across so that the man in the street, if you like, who's got no bone to bear either way, who's willing to say, I believe this party's got the best policies. I'm voting for the Christian People's Alliance because I'm not a Christian, but I like their policies and I think they're the best policies for the country. That's our aim. We're not just looking for the votes of Christians. Obviously, people that are positively anti-Christian are unlikely to vote for us because they're anti-Christian. But the majority of people in the country don't fit that category, and it's quite possible for us to get elected. I mean, even in the last census, there was 59% of people said that Christianity was the religion nearest to their own. So if half of them actually voted for us in an election, we'd be pretty close to winning the election. So we don't have to get all the votes of all the people that are positively anti-Christian to win.
No, I get that, and it wasn't a question, of course, to catch you out. It was just more of a point of.
No, I know.
I understand. It's a difficult environment.
It's a perfect valid point, because we can't win an election just on the votes of committed Christians. I mean, I fully understand that, but we can win an election without the votes of the people that are anti-Christian.
Now, one way you might actually be able to win some votes is with this next question for people who are currently within the Conservative Party. What makes Christian People's Alliance different from the Conservative Party?
Well, we're principled, if you like, and we offer a place of principle. It's quite interesting, actually. I got on quite well with the guy that actually won the seat here in Hitchin and Harpenden this time. He didn't seem to like me at all in 2017, but I think in 2019 he realised that actually this guy's worth listening to. And one of the things I said to him is that you should never sacrifice principle for power.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid the position of the Conservative Party is absolutely to sacrifice principle for power. So we've got to get into power, and who cares about the principles? We can think about them when we're in power. Where our position is to be very strong on principle, on values, on Christian values, not sacrificing our values ever to get into power, but always maintaining our values as the right position for society.
Yeah.
Now, I believe that that is an attractive position for a lot of people. And I believe on that basis that there will be some people that will say, yeah, I don't want to just vote for anyone just to be in power. I'd rather support a party that is principled. It is, I can totally understand people within the Conservative Party who say, well, I want to be a councillor, and it's going to be very hard for me to be a councillor supporting the Christian People's Alliance, or I want to be an MP, and it's going to be very hard for me to be an MP supporting the Christian People's Alliance. I understand that position, but we need people that are willing to think long term.
Yeah.
Long term, we can be in power. Long term, short term, we can't, but long term, we can. So, and God willing, long term, we will.
Perfect answer. Do you have anything else you'd like to bring up on the podcast at all? Anything we might have missed, or anything you want to add to earlier points raised?
No, I don't think so. I think it's been a very, very interesting discussion. I believe that we've got a very strong manifesto. It's interesting. People that read our manifesto almost invariably say, "Oh, I like your manifesto. It's excellent." And to me, that's the core of any successful party. I mean, I know you don't want me to be speaking against other parties, but
I don't mind it. I don't mind it. It's all good discussion nonetheless.
Okay, well, I was talking once to people in the English Democrats who, at one time, were a party of very similar size to us.
Yeah.
And I was saying, what are your values? What is the difference between the English Democrats and UKIP? Because obviously you're both anti-EU. You both seem to have very similar policies in general.
Yeah.
And he said, well, we don't like the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish. Oh, so UKIP then obviously campaigning in Scotland and Wales, but you're just campaigning for England. Well, yeah. So let's vote for English Democrats then if you hate the Scots and the Welsh. It's just like, well, to me, that doesn't have a lot of appeal to it. But I'd like people to think that what we're standing for is for values that our society needs and that no other party is putting forward. And no one can come to the Christian People's Alliance and say, well, if I support this other party, haven't they got similar policies to you? There isn't a party out there that's got similar policies.
I've found it difficult to make any connection between yourselves and even your closest, you could say, competitor party being the Conservative Party. There is no similarities at all.
Yeah, so we've got something very distinctive to offer, and for that reason, I really believe that the point could easily come where suddenly we take off and people say, "Yeah, this is good." You see, I also know, to be honest with you, I've been around in politics for a little while, so I also know that there's no guarantee that the momentum will be only forwards. The momentum can also be backwards.
Yeah.
And the Liberal Democrats, you see, have really made a massive mistake over tuition fees. But I also believe they made a big mistake when Nick Clegg debated Nigel Farage and told us that if we leave the European Union, we would lose 3 million jobs. That's what he said in that debate. And you then get to a point where people say, you can't believe this party.
No.
They say if we're in power, under no circumstances will we ever vote to increase tuition fees, and then they actually do what they said under no circumstances would they ever do. And they've told us that these terrible things will happen if we leave the European Union, but they're just completely untrue. So how can we vote for a party that's not being honest with us? So you realise we've got a commitment right from the beginning that everything we say, we guarantee will be true. We will go through with everything that we promise to do. We will not go back on anything that we say. And we are a party that you can rely on. We have to be in that position. And that's the only position to be in to go forward from strength to strength, because otherwise you're going to have setbacks.
Well, I think on that point you've just said there, I think this is a good point to end it. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I'd like to thank Sid for coming on today and representing the Christian People's Alliance. I have, again, enjoyed it, and I wish you and your party all the best.
Thank you.
If you'd like to learn anything more about the Christian People's Alliance, their website is cpaparty.net. I would also like to thank everyone who has been listening to the Conservative Alliance podcast. Before we go, I'd appreciate that if our listeners have enjoyed our podcast, to hit like, press subscribe, and until next time, goodbye.